So on behalf of Columbia University School of Professional Studies Nonprofit Management Program, I'd like to welcome our online panelists and audience to tonight's conversation about the response of immigrant nonprofits to the pandemic and Black Lives Matter movement. I'm Erwin De Leon, and I'm a lecturer in the Nonprofit Management Program. We are honored to have with us tonight Erica Andiola, who's the Chief Advocacy Officer of Raíces, a legal and social service organization in Texas. And with more immigration lawyers than any other organization in the state, in 2018, Raíces managed 37,863 cases at no cost to its clients. Services extend from low-cost residency and citizenship services to pro bono representation for families and children in detention. Raíces also offers a wide range of services, including case management, resettlement assistance, a national hotline to connect migrants with local community resources, and transit support for recently released migrants. We also have with us Eddie Taveras, who is the New York State Immigration Director of Forward US. It's a bipartisan political organization that seeks to remedy our broken immigration and criminal justice system. This team of political campaigners span the fields of policy, advocacy, and technology, and include people from a variety of backgrounds, ideologies, and lived experiences. And we have Joanne Yu, who's the Executive Director of the Asian American Federation, a membership organization that works with the nearly 70 nonprofits that represent and support the Pan-Asian community in the Northeast US. These agencies work in the fields of health and human services, education, economic development, civic participation, and social justice. If you have any questions for our panelists, please type them in the chat box and I will field them as we go along. And if you happen to be tweeting, which we encourage you to, please use the hashtags #pandemic and protest. Again, that's #pandemic and protest and #CUSPS nonprofit. That's CUSPS nonprofit. So before we begin our conversation, I'd like to cite some numbers for context. Can we have the slide, please? So right now, there are more than 44 million immigrants living in the US, or approximately 14% of the entire population. Most immigrants live in California, Texas, Florida, New York, and New Jersey. Now, at the outset of the pandemic, immigrants were summoned to the front lines. The Migration Policy Institute estimates that 6 million immigrant workers are at the forefront of the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. So while immigrants represent 17% of the US workforce, they account for larger shares at the front line of this pandemic. 29% of all physicians and 38% of home health aides. Immigrants are also overrepresented in the hospitality, service, and care sectors, which, as we all know, have been really decimated by the economic downturn. Now, in the middle of the pandemic, the Black Lives Movement also gained steam in reaction to the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many others. Immigrant communities have risen to support the movement. So during this time of pandemic and protest, how have immigrant nonprofits served their constituents and the wider community? So I'd like to start with you, Joanne. Can you tell us about the communities your member organization serves? How have your constituents been affected by the pandemic, by the ongoing social unrest?
Great, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to join such esteemed colleagues talking about something really critical happening in our community. I will say, I wanna recognize and raise up all of our member agencies and all the nonprofits who've been working really diligently, really hard from day one to keep our communities alive. I mean, what we're seeing is, we see all of these mutual aid organizations cropping up, neighbors organizing to keep each other alive. And, for us, we've been very pointed that what what this means is the failure of government to reach out to our communities. If the government had their act together, these neighborhood organizations would not be forming, and we would not be in this position. I think what we're seeing a lot is, our nonprofits, especially the direct services nonprofits, that never closed. They opened the whole time. They risked their health. They came to work. It's been really painful. It's been incredibly emotional. The cause that I have with our EDs, talking about what they're seeing. There's a lot of anxiety. It's about what we're seeing in the community. It's about what we're feeling with our own families and how vulnerable we feel. And with our staff, how do we protect our staff? Yet we have to go in because we're seeing all kinds of things. Where immigration, thank you so much for lifting up those numbers. For the Asian American community, there's a huge number of because of language access, immigrants haven't necessarily been able to access mainstream job. This is a story, right? Despite the fact that, there's this model minority myth about Asian Americans because, we're all making millions of dollars at Google. The reality is that the poorest New Yorkers are Asian from our community. So the challenge is that, these poor immigrants have had to go to work. If you look at the New York City deportation numbers, the top three, of the 10 top 10 deport countries that immigrants are being deported to, number one is China, and we have India and we have Bangladesh. So we have immigration, and deportation is a huge issue in our community. And if you look at this, it means that there are vulnerable immigrants in our community. And so for them, how do you live during a global pandemic when everything is closed? You don't go to work, you don't have money, the restaurants are closed. Our most vulnerable New Yorkers have had to cobble together a way for them to eat and survive. And we look at the numbers of deaths in our community, and we know that for the Asian American community, the numbers are probably not accurately reflected because so many, as you've said, have been, they work in industries, they work in fields where there isn't necessarily, it's all service industry, right? And so they don't necessarily haven't been captured. And so, I lift up all of our executive directors, I lift up all the nonprofits out there. I know how hard they're hustling. I know the sleepless nights. I know that for the first, now that things are slowly trying to sort of get back to normal, we've been, these folks we've never stopped working. I think we work longer hours now. So I really want to recognize, what that means. And, I really appreciate this opportunity. I mean, on top of all of this, if this wasn't insane enough for the Asian American community, because of all of the hate crime stuff, right? As soon as we get the coronavirus, and then, there's, they're saying it's from China, then you knew that it was going to be open season on the Asian American community. And sure enough, so many of the small businesses in our ethnic enclaves closed. The small businesses closed in January because there was no way for them to keep open because they weren't getting customers. And I know this sounds really crazy if you are a logical thinking person. If the Asian American enclave, I've been saying to people, you can't catch the coronavirus through DNA. Just because you're Chinese American doesn't mean that you don't, like somehow it's not transmitted to you, right? You have to have traveled. But, there's all of this, paranoia, and, leave it to the racists. They'll never miss an opportunity to, hate on somebody. And this time we were on the receiving end. I think that is still ongoing. I think East Asian, obviously, community has been harmed. The small businesses have really suffered, but also anybody who looks East Asian, the Filipino community, the Himalayan community, right? Like everybody has been targeted. So it's been an incredibly sad time. It's been incredibly frightening time. And for the Asian American Federation, we're right in the middle of a census. We're trying to get headcounts. What does that work like when now we are supposed to be, out in the streets, like getting people to apply, but at this point, everybody's home, how much outreach can we technically do when we're all stuck at home? And so it's been a lot of work. It's been frustrating. We don't know when we're going to go back. There's a lot of uncertainty. And I think for me, as the executive director, you know, I tell my staff all the time that I'm going through this 12-step like grieving process. And for some reason, I am just completely stuck on the rage part. I mean, I'm frustrated. I'm angry about what is happening, how invisible communities of color have been, how immigrant communities have been. And if you look at who died during this pandemic, obviously my rage is stuck in, you know, my frustration, my feelings are stuck in rage, and the dial has been torn off. So I will stop here with my answer.
Well, I do want to pick up on a couple of things that you've talked about, right? So particularly for those of us with lively Chinatowns or enclaves, right? Asian immigrant enclaves that have been affected. So clearly the pandemic has affected the Asian American community business-wise, in terms of the businesses, as well as individually, right? In terms of attacks and what have you. So can you say more, like give examples of what your member organizations, how do they support these individuals and businesses, right? Because clearly there was some PPP, some money that came from the federal government. So can you speak to that? Is that something that Chinese and other Asian businesses have been able to access? So yeah, a number of questions there, but to drill down on what your nonprofits have been doing for the Asian American community.
Sure. I think for our social services, they were open because they needed to get food to people, they needed to get to seniors. The mental health folks had to do wellness checks through cell phones. And some of the staff members of the nonprofits have had to go to seniors' homes to format the cell phone so that way they could actually dial in and they can do wellness checks. I think you know, despite how difficult this has been, there's been tremendous innovation. The nonprofit staff have been amazing. I know that some of the earliest calls I got were from the domestic violence organization, because the clients, you know, when you are home living with your abuser, you know, what happens to you, right? You can't leave. Nobody's allowed to leave. And so you're home. And so, you know, we know that there's been a huge spike in cases of domestic violence, and the victims have wanted to come into the centers. They don't want to call in because, you know, your abuser is sitting next to you. So they've had to run programs the whole time. When we talk about small businesses, you know, this is an opportunity. You know, all of these conversations, all the questions you're asking me, this is exactly what we talked about at the staff meeting today. It is understanding the infrastructure and the complexity of our community. I think the Asian American community, the ethnicity, you know, it's not just Chinese or Koreans or Filipinos. It is many ethnicities, many languages, many enclaves. If you look at the New York City numbers, Asian Americans make up at least 10% of the population in over half of the city council districts. You know, and I always cite this number to give our community some political oomph, you know, some political will to remind them that we have tremendous power. If people got together and went out and flexed their political muscle, there are things that can happen for us. And so, you know, that's certainly something that we need to look at as elections are coming up. But the PPP question, you know, the challenge of PPP, if we look at some of the neighborhoods in New York City where we had the lowest number of PPP approval, they're in immigrant communities, the Asian American communities. Asian American small businesses, the whole language access thing, right? Like if you don't read English well, how do you navigate something like that? And it's been not just the Asian immigrant, but I think it's like immigrants and most small businesses, right? And so we're trying to figure out how do we get people in front of them. And the other challenge I want to say is, you know, the banks at some point realized that the return on investment wasn't good enough, so they weren't responding to people's applications. We are hearing all kinds of stories. And there was a limitation in PPP, so you can only cover staff. So if you are a mom and pop shop and you have one or two employees, it's not like you're going to get a ton of money, you know? And so they had to make the calculation of, is all this paperwork and me hiring somebody to help, you know, me getting a bookkeeper or, you know, a CPA to help me, is this a risk that's worth taking? So I think there's been a lot of, you know, those kind of conversations. I just, you know, from our work, working with small businesses, you know, my small business staff, they got calls at all hours of the night. People were terrified. And the Asian American small businesses in all the enclaves, they closed much sooner. You know, we had a mandate to close in March, but they closed in January, because why keep a restaurant open if nobody's coming? So, you know, for the Asian American small businesses, especially in the enclaves, it's been over 6 months for us. So now that we're opening, and now there are all these rules about, you know, you can open and sit in the sidewalk cafes, blah, blah, blah. You know, some of these policies don't really reflect our small businesses. You know, if you're a small shop, you know, and you can't really set up shop outside. There's also paperwork you have to submit. It's impossible, you know, who's going to help them with the paperwork? So I know that right now, you know, there's a lot of panic, there's a lot of pain, and there are, most days I feel like we're building that runway and building that plan as we go. But we know that Asian American small businesses are, you know, they're a huge economic support to our city. During the last great election, the Asian American small businesses created almost half the net new jobs in the city. So it's not just to say, you know, everybody says that small businesses are the economic engine of our economy. Well, they really are. And we need to recognize that. And we need to recognize the innovations of immigrant small business owners.
Great. Well, thank you, Joanne. I think let's move now towards the West, to Texas. So, Erica, what are you seeing over on the ground, as it were?
Where do we start? There's so much. There's so much. You know, I was taking notes to prepare, and I was like, I don't think we can just put a short list of things that the immigrant community are going through, because I feel like every day there's something new. So we just got to keep adding to the list. But what I would say, you know, with Raíces, you know, we do provide social services and legal services. And just a year ago, we started our advocacy department as well. So now we are doing also advocacy, because, you know, if we don't change the system, at the end of the day, we're never going to be able to end this attacks. But, you know, one of the, we provide affirmative services, so DACA, citizenship, you know, you name it. Also, we serve families in detention and individuals in detention centers, as well as the children. We have a children's program who, you know, our attorneys basically work in the shelters, providing representation for minors. And all throughout, you know, just I can't even name right now or think of a community within just, you know, all the people who we serve that it's right now not going through a hard time. And I wouldn't say it's just because of COVID. I think that there's two things happening here. There's everything that the Trump administration is doing to, you know, attack the immigrant community in all fronts, but also COVID is making it even harder.
Right.
Before, you know, I'll just kind of talk a little bit about the issues of the border with a lot of our clients. Also in the United States, for a lot of the immigrants who we serve here, as well as people in detention. But I would say that the border, you know, one of the biggest challenges, even before COVID, was MPP, which is some others know it as Remain in Mexico. We had a lot of our clients who were basically stuck in Mexico because, you know, they have to go through all this process now to be able to request asylum. So many of them, you know, were stuck in Mexico. And now we have seen even less people be able to request asylum. And the majority of times, you know, they're waiting in Mexico for a really long time, or they just get deported back to the country of origin. We were just talking to our children's program not too long ago, and even within the shelters, they've seen way less children who are there. And don't get me wrong, we don't want children to be detained at all, but this is not because children are being released. This is because there's literally deportations of unaccompanied minors, people who are coming by themselves. They're deporting them back on their own because of COVID. Well, we know that's more because it's because of a lot of other things, but they're using this as an excuse. And then also within you know, the detention centers right now, one of our biggest campaigns in collaboration with our family detention program is to try to get all of the families out of detention centers. There's 3 detention centers in this country. A lot of Americans don't know that these specific facilities are owned by private companies and hold entire families. Could be mother, child, and dad, or it could be one of the parents with a child. And we have we're very worried because we got notice, you know, from one of the judges from California, basically just said last week that ICE has to release all of the children by July 27th, which for a lot of people sound like great news, but there's a caveat to it that the judge didn't say anything about the parents. And so our biggest concern is that we're going to start seeing either family separation happen again, or there's going to be a way for ICE to keep the entire families there for, you know, for long. And this includes mostly an average of the age of the children are like 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds. I mean, they're babies. So we're really pushing for this to, for the families to be released. Most of the families are now being tested, and at Karnes Detention Center, where we have services, we have seen now that there's, I think last time I heard, there's definitely over 20 people who have tested positive for COVID. And it's not just the virus that is affecting them, it's also that they're not isolating the families. And so dad is somewhere else, child and mom are somewhere else, and many times they're stuck in literally in a jail cell, a child, for a really long time. And so, you know, again, I can name a lot more issues that we're seeing, the undocumented community as well. But, you know, we're trying our hardest to help in any way we can. And also, you know, like I said, using advocacy to continue to lift up the stories and ensure that, you know, we as you know, it was mentioned before that we can also have people be more excited about going to vote and have a different reality in the future.
Well, before we go to Eddie, so let me ask you, what access do nonprofits or service organizations have? What access do they have to the families and the children in the detention centers? Is there access at all? Who's got them tested, or who's taking care of them?
Yeah, so Raíces has access to the Karnes Family Detention Center, which is located in Texas, in Karnes City. And there's also another nonprofit that works in Dealey Detention Center, which is another one that's located in Texas. And then the other one is in Pennsylvania, and there's another nonprofit working there. So Raíces, we have access to families now online. So our attorneys used to be able to go in person, and we'll be able to visit every family and be able to support them through their credible fear interviews, basically everything that they needed. We would be able to support them as much as we could through our legal services, and sometimes even doing advocacy campaigns on some of the cases. But now, because of COVID, we have transitioned into doing consultations via, you know, online, which has been a little bit harder because, you know, it's just important for us to not just provide the legal services, but also to be able to build trust and be able to have a lot more ways to support the families. But as you can imagine, just, you know, doing this online doesn't necessarily create that trust as much as we used to have it.
Gosh, agreed. So this would be a good segue, Eddie. So both Joanne and Erica talked about the importance of advocacy and working towards change, right? So maybe can you speak, tell us a little bit about what Forward USA is doing in terms of immigration policy?
Thank you for having me, and very honored to be here with Joanne, who's one of the New York's finest advocates here, and Erica, who I'm just meeting, but have been I guess, some sort of fan, and you've been an inspiration in how you unapologetically advocate, against anyone. So I appreciate both of you. In the way that, forward.us works, we focus, I like to say, in three main sort of fields. One is like communication, the other one's legislative advocacy, and then digital capacity building and outreach. And some of the work that we've done there is sort of changing the narrative of what's going on now. But even prior to this, noting that when this administration came in with their xenophobic and racist agenda, what occurred during the pandemic, or is occurring currently now, has just exacerbated the issues that have already gone on. And you heard from Erica and Joanne saying a lot of the things. So I know while people say, this is the great equalizer, quite the opposite. This is one of the greatest dividers, really showing us who are the marginalized community. Joanne was talking about specifically New York City as to who's being affected, and you can clearly and easily trace that not just to economic, but also immigration status, type of diversity, and race. And there's something to that, right? It's not just that this pandemic is attached to a sector of people, as again, this administration has tried to paint it, but it's a intentional sort of system that is built to continue to, hit our communities. So ways that we've tried to do here at Forward is changing the narrative. At the time, we were dealing with the DACA Supreme Court case, which luckily, it was a favorable win, and really elevating the voices of DACA recipients. And I think an estimated 200,000 DACA recipients were either essential workers or healthcare professionals on the front line, while still having their status sort of leverage, above their head. They picked up the pace, and without a question, and to not just DACA recipients, but also undocumented people, without a choice as well, went into the front lines to fight this pandemic. So what we did is step up and help these individuals tell a different narrative that is not just on the economics, but on the humanity of these individuals, and what they, what the contribution they give to not just their immediate family, but our greater community. I think we can all here trace our background for me not too long ago, and the opportunity that it's given us. So it's really changing that narrative. I think from a sort of national policy perspective, we've been focused on, the Dream Empowerment Act, HR 6, which was passed last week, to ensure a pathway to citizenship for TPS and DACA recipients, accounting for 2.5 million. And, that's a great, and that was sort of a shift as to why we need to ensure that these folks are protected, noting that there are 11+ million people that also deserve and should be getting additional permanent protection. We also, in the HEROES Act, really fighting to ensure that mixed status families and undocumented immigrants that file via the ITIN number get economic relief. The CARES Act, the CARES Act 2.0, purposely left out many, and not most, undocumented immigrants and immigrants as well. And this is part of sort of the Trump's agenda, right? To ensure that our community continues to suffer, make it so bad, but we are still continuing to be resilient. So we're pushing in the HEROES Act to ensure they get economic relief. And then here in New York, more locally, where I get to work with people like Joanne and the organization she represents, we've been working on the Protect Our Courts Act, which will make it illegal for ICE to detain or arrest any undocumented immigrant going to and from courthouses or in courthouses grounds. It just passed the Assembly yesterday. We are hoping the Senate will done it very quickly. So those are some of the ways that we are helping move this further, and making sure that immigrants, and particularly undocumented immigrants without any kind of protection, have access to resources that aren't readily available and or are available with those with documentation. Additionally, some things we do at Forward.us is that we invest in communities and organizations that are already on the ground, leading the work, doing the work, and mobilizing their constituency. We partner with them, we listen to them. Because we're not a direct service organization, I a lot of time lean on folks like Joanne and Erica to really tell us what's going on the ground, and really bridge sort of that gap and be parallel and complementary into the work that they do. And I just want to also note that as you mentioned earlier, the social unrest, it's important to note that, there are Black immigrants, there are Black undocumented immigrants, and this is just the killing and targeting by police on Black and brown people, particularly Black men. I just want to note that Black immigrants have to navigate these unsafe spaces, in thinking about not being undocumented, but also being detained because of their color and potentially kill. And so that this is just another level of things that this pandemic has brought into light to more people. There are many of us in the movement that have already noted this, but it's now clearer to the broader people that this is an issue, this is a systemic issue, and this is an intentional issue that has been built over the years.
Well, I think definitely both the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement have really brought to fore things that those of us know about, but most people don't. But before I ask a follow-up question, Eddie, I just want to encourage the audience, if anyone has any questions, to please type it in chat. I didn't realize our conversation is going so well. We're halfway through. So if you have any questions, please type it in right now. So Eddie, you mentioned how you partner with nonprofits on the ground, right? So say a bit more, like if for instance, I manage a small nonprofit, or I volunteer for one, or how do nonprofits, how can they help in the advocacy effort and actually help change policy? And Joanne, Erica, feel free to chime in as well.
Sorry for stepping away very quickly.
That's okay.
Some of the ways that in which I get their assistance is sort of in listening what their constituents needs and what are the issues, right? Noting when ICE is ramping up their raids, right? And what does that mean from a intersectional point of local and state and citywide work versus federal work, right? And what can our elected officials be doing? One of our job is not only to sort of advocate for policies, but is also to push the conversation forward with these elected officials. We are bipartisan, so we do it both sides whenever we can with Republican, given the political climate, but it's to educate them and push them on doing what's right and why they were elected to do it. So I depend on partners like Joanne to give us the data, to give us the sentiment, and also the feel, right? Because we're not monolithic. We are different. We have different ethnicity, races, and experiences. And so what I try to do, and what we try to do at Forward, is capsulate that and see how we can message it to the other side, to people more on the moderate or sort of center right. So those are some of the ways that we partner with different organizations.
Yes,
And
Erica, Tran.
I just wanted to also lift up what Eddie has said. Missing from this conversation, obviously, is the African immigrant community, because they are one of the fastest growing. And, with the Black Lives Movement, I can only imagine, being Black and being immigrant and the undocumented population, what that is like. And, through some of my personal work, I've been able to, reach out to them and do some work with them personally. And, it always makes me cry because I know how they live, right? Like how undocumented communities live. And I think the other reality of all of this work really is solidarity. I think, at the end of the day, it is solidarity, solidarity, solidarity. We can't be at all places at once because most of us are small organizations, and there is we don't have, $20 million, or we don't have, 5,000 staff members. And so we need to rely on each other to feed us what the issues are. And so when it comes to some of the issues that Eddie works on, I'm going to take my cues from him. And if he sends me an email says, hey, by the way, you need to send out this email to the members so that way they can weigh in, right? It might not impact the Asian American community, but we always stand together. you know, what is happening at the southern borders.
Mm-hmm.
We're seeing like, how do you lock up children in cages, right? So when raíces came up, you know, everybody's, you know, it really is about solidarity and supporting the work that, you know, all of these amazing folks are doing.
Mm-hmm.
And like, you know, at the end of the day, it's like, this is our job, but it's also like our passion.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, all of our work is enmeshed. And I always tell everybody, you know, in the immigrant rights field, in the communities of color, we are really, if you sit down and map out who we know, we really, you know, are like 2 degrees of separation. We all kind of sort of know each other.
That's true.
Right in the same circles.
Yeah. Erica, did you want to add anything to this? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think one of the reasons, well, actually, I'll tell a little bit of background and story of Raíces. I mean, Raíces started as a legal services organization 30 years ago. And one of the amazing things about the organization is that our attorneys, even though they were service providers, and now we also have social workers who are service providers, have always advocated themselves for you know, the community we serve. And sometimes that meant being a little uncomfortable with you know, making some of the people, whether it's a you know, government agency, you know, who provides a grant, or whether it was, you know, somebody who was giving us money, because at the end of the day, our mission is to ensure that we stop working on this issue, right? Like that at some point, we're no longer having to be providing the services. And so at some point, Raíces basically decided, you know, once we were able to build our capacity in 2018, when we had so much support from the community, we had a viral fundraiser. And I think the organization was really blessed to have this. And now, because of that, we were able to build a whole department of advocacy in which we are using our own capacity to not only be able to provide that service to, you know, to the client, but to really empower that community member to speak for themselves, to tell their own stories, to feel like, you know what, I'm just gonna go to Raíces to be able to get my citizenship done or my DACA done, but that I can also say, why am I doing this, and what else can I do to also fight for the rest of my community? And it's been really amazing to see that. And also, I think it's super important that we keep that connection between the nonprofits that just provide services and also the DC organizations, or just organizations who do advocacy. Because at the end of the day, you know, whatever policy happens, whatever changes happen, they have to be informed by what is actually happening on the ground. And that really requires relationships more than anything. It's just continuing to build those relationships, and not being afraid at this moment to throw the spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks, because there's no other choice. We're going to continue to get attacked until the end of the administration.
Well, I was going to go into funding, but talk about spaghetti hitting the wall and what might stick. Let's go there a bit. What do you all think the future holds for us, right? Considering we're really in this interesting is a word, a challenging time. Elections are coming up. So what's in store for immigrant communities and for the nonprofits that serve them? Are you hopeful? Can we make the change happen?
I can go first. I think I am incredibly hopeful. You know, this is probably the only, you know, protest that I've actually couldn't participate because of, you know, underlying health issues. But I see all the young people out there, and it's incredibly moving. You know, it's just this amazing solidarity, people understanding how brutal you know, law enforcement has been with the Black community and what they've suffered. And so I see all of these young people out there. And, you know, when I get together with my friends, like, you know, we're all in our late 50s, we always say like, oh my God, we're so old, let the kids do it, right? We're really proud of our kids. But then as we also watch the young people go out to form this new conversation, you know, one of the things that we also need to be mindful is, and this is part of all of the government testimonies that I give, is that, you know, what this pandemic has really exposed is the inequalities of this country, right? Like if you look at who died, it's Black and brown communities, and they died because there haven't been resources. There's been very little investments made in their infrastructure, housing, healthcare, right? Like nutrition. And for the Asian American community, you know, this is, you know, we got hit by the pandemic of racism, and we also suffered tremendously for an economic arena. And so, you know, I think human nature says we all have to go out, you know, once this is over and there's a vaccine or whatever, right? Or, you know, whatever, there's medication. Everybody's going to want to rush out and do all the things that they did before, because that's what feels good, right? As human beings, like you want to do what you want to try to get your life back to what is considered normal and before Corona, right? But I hope that, you know, everybody takes a moment to realize that that normal never included people who look like us, right? That normal is really not, is what got us in this first, got us here in the first place. We do need to make investments in the communities that have been impacted. We do need to start to have communities of color talk to each other. You know, for the Asian American community, what, you know, standing, you know, I see a lot of young people going out, and our elders also going out to the BLM protests. If you look at the Asian American history, you know, our history, you know, there's been and a lot of people ask me like, oh my gosh, you know, how do we start to talk about, you know, anti-Blackness in our community? But some of the most important movements that, you know, happened to the Asian American community was in conjunction with the Black community. And you know, so there's always been that cooperation. I mean, like, you know, I want to tell young people, if you don't know your own history, you're going to say stupid things and you're going to piss me off. But there's a lot of history, there's movement, and we need to acknowledge but we also need to acknowledge the contributions of immigrants, of the contributions that, you know, I look at. A lot of young people say, oh, I'm frustrated with my parents because they don't seem to understand, you know, Black Lives Matter. But I also, you know, want to say, do you talk to your parents about what they faced when they came here as immigrants? Like, you know, I'm sure they have tons of stories of how painful it was for them to not speak the language, the jobs that they had to take, they had to take to put food on the table. You know, like how, you know, like compassion, empathy, love is not pie, right? Just because you give it to, you know, gazillion people, it doesn't deplete you. And how do we really, at this point, when it's really this transformative time in our country, how do we really, you know, make room for us to talk to each other, to talk to those of us in our own families, but those of us who aren't from our families, who are our neighbors, who might be on the other side of the aisle. I think, you know, we need to at least try, and, you know, a lot of olive branches need to go to get extended. And so for me, I always feel like, yeah, it was really easy to be angry, and I still am angry, but I'm also incredibly hopeful by what I see out there. And, you know, there are amazing young people doing amazing things. And, you know, it's just fantastic time to be alive right now.
Wonderful. So what role, okay, so that's at the individual level, but at the organizational level, what can our organizations do to bring our communities together? And maybe let's listen to the young ones in this table, at this table right now. Eddie, Erica, yes.
I guess I could take a crack at it. So I think to answer like your original question, I'm like cautiously optimistic. There's been enough of certain like trends that we've seen that somehow we tend to, you know, go 3 steps back. I think, you know, as a person who's like, you know, part of this like movement generation that is pushing forward, it's refreshing to see, you know, the mantle being given to folks to lead, and you see how different the ideas and how quickly it moves when we are at the table, and not just sitting quietly at the table, but actually being part of the decision making, the strategy making, et cetera. And that, of course, goes with diversity in all part of that sense. So I'm cautiously optimistic. I think one of the things that we could do is making sure as an organization, but also as individuals, like making sure that we do not idolize our leaders to a point where we can hold them accountable. And I think that is the tricky situation, because when that idolization it blinds you, then you stop serving the community you came here to serve. And so one thing I like about where I'm at professionally and also sort of philosophically is that working for a bipartisan organization is that you must hold every person accountable, whether this is, whether this administration or the next administration to come. We cannot let up, right? And just because one is less worse or much better than the other, it doesn't mean we sort of get satisfied with what they give us, right? We have to demand for people, because what we're talking about here is people's humanity. And it's not just like the economic sense, which is beautiful and sounds great. And, it helps, lead certain groups here and there, but it's a humanity of people that we are really fighting for. And so that's one of the things I would say is that about this generation is that we're not content to what ideology we want to, we expect more and better things from our peers, but also the people that are elected or being seen to lead.
Well, thank goodness, definitely for your generation. I see that as well. Erica?
Yeah, and would you mind repeating the questions? I've been listening to both of our panelists, and I'm like super into what they're saying, and I forgot the question.
Right, we were just talking about the future, right? And whether, like, how do we see the future? Are we hopeful or not, or what needs to be done? But I suppose let's bring it back to immigrant nonprofits. What can our organizations do, right, to improve not just the immigrant communities, but America as a whole, right? What role do our organizations, what roles can they play?
Oh, the future, it's sometimes hard to think of the future when you're just like dealing with all the current situation. But I would say it's important that we do so. And just that I'm not repeating a lot of what's already been said. I think one of the things that's been on our mind a lot is 4 months from now. I mean, we're already in July. And if my math is failing, I'm sorry, but about 4 to 5 months, I don't know.
Yeah.
There's not only an election, there's also the aftermath of the election. Yes. What does that mean for us financially as organizations? What does that mean for the constituency we serve? And, there's a lot of different scenarios. And one of the things that we talked some with our Raíces leadership is, even if a Democratic president was to win, what we saw in the last presidency is that there wasn't as much sort of like fire, in the bellies of all these folks who wanted to support. And, I think when family separation happened, this is where Raíces got a lot of the support. I know that ACLU, for example, got a lot of support. I mean, there's Black Lives Matter right now, the movement and movement for Black Lives is getting a lot of support right now. And so there's been, right, this kind of waves of support that has happened for some of the nonprofits. But, if we look back at the Obama era, there wasn't that much of as much individual support. I think, there was a lot of like funding that came from funders and sort of organizations. But so that's one thing that we need to really start thinking about it and not just wait until it happens and then we're like, there's nobody, not a lot of people are thinking about the urgency of a Trump administration. Right. And then the other part of this is our constituency and really start to think, I mean, honestly, if there's another 4 years of Trump, and I'm just like sweating just thinking about it, there's going to be, I think he's gonna come harder at us, and we have to prepare to have, the way in which we function. I think we've learned a little bit about being sort of reactive and react to urgencies. I think we're gonna have to be even more prepared for reactive urgencies, and we can't plan everything out. That's just the reality. And then the other end, if there is a Democratic president, I think day one, we have to
Mhm.
be on the streets. We gotta hold folks accountable and ensure that whoever is talking to members of Congress and whoever's talking to the new president, that there is, again, that connection
Mhm.
with the services providers to ensure that whatever we're seeing is actually being heard in the
Mhm.
halls of power.
Yeah, and you're right. I'm glad you brought up, and it's actually a question I wanted to circle back to. It's around funding, right? And how do we keep the nonprofit infrastructure going? So, as you pointed out, there was a bump, at least with some organizations, with Black Lives Matter, right? A lot of people realizing that support is needed. So, my question to all of you on the panel, but particularly to Joanne and Erica, is like, did this bump in funding, um, was this windfall for all organizations, some organizations, just BLM related organizations, and what is needed for the sector to fortify itself? Because as you point out, it doesn't matter who wins the election. Reality is the work continues. So how does it look, Joanne, Erica, and maybe Eddie, in terms of just funding and the actual survival of our organizations?
So I really love what Eddie said about, holding people accountable. I think for the past 4 years, all we've done is try to hold a line. And I think when we, fingers crossed, when we have a new administration, and all the times that we're, tweeting things out and we're calling people, I keep saying like, oh, what happened to our plan for demanding comprehensive immigration reform?
Mhm.
Like, do we give that up? And I realized, no, it's because we've had to uh,
Mhm.
try to hang on to as many of our community members as possible. And it's been exhausting. About funding, I think, politics happens in, with swings, right? Like we had 8 years Obama where, things weren't it wasn't just insanity like we have to deal with
Mhm.
now. But at some point it will come around again. This type of, this is how it works in America. And so I think, anytime there's a break, I think we need to build infrastructure. And I know that in New York City, the communities of color, we are underfunded, and this is the other fight that we're having for the Asian American community. We are almost 16% of the population. The dollars that we get to support our community, it's 1.4% of the dollars. I mean, we're not. And I'm not ever saying like, oh my God, you're X percent of the population, so therefore you should get X number of dollars. But this pandemic has just exposed like who's getting the money and who's not getting the money. It's not communities of color getting the funding. So we need to be able to push back. We have New York City elections coming up. And we need to make sure that we get people into power who recognize all of the money. I mean, ultimately, money is power dynamics.
Yes.
And so we need to ask the question of like, where's the resources for our community? How do we build immigration legal services? How do we do food programs? Like, how do we, there are all of these things that we need to put in place. And, I am building my list. And trust me, I have questions for all of the mayoral candidates about how will they will support not just the Asian American community, and not just the communities of color, but also the immigrant community. New York City, we can't say we're an immigrant receiving city, and we can't say we're a sanctuary city. We need to live those values. And so there wasn't much money coming. They're not coming even during the pandemic. There was very little. I think some of the foundations did much better than others, but and then for the nonprofit organizations, for our member agencies, they had to use whatever new money came in to do COVID programming. They didn't get to do their old programming. They had to, spend money to put up partitions, do food programs, do extra food programs. So, that money, whatever money people got, it went really fast. And so, when we get out, we're going to need to figure out how do we get communities of color, immigrant communities together to work together to push and demand the resources that we need.
Well, we're about running out of time, but we do have one question, which I think is a good one. So this is for our panel. is there any multi-organization initiative in NYC or nationwide that anyone is aware of to mobilize the immigrant communities to get out the vote? So is there one, two, or is there an initiative to get out the vote?
I think every community is doing that. I mean, Erica and Eddie, you know, I think we're all doing that. I think we're all trying to raise the issues. You know, the census work, to be honest, is a really good jumping off point for us to do this work. But you know, there are a lot of opportunities for young people to be involved. I want to plug that, you know, we are looking for interns. And so if there's if anybody wants to sign up and come in and work with us, we would love to have you. You know, and all of these conversations about, you know, the voting and engaging people, you know, we do need to think about that, because if you know, look at what happened in New York, I know Eddie is going to know, with like mail-in ballots and that debacle, right? So, and we might be in this situation, continue to be in this situation in November. So we do need to figure out a plan. So, you know, we welcome anybody to help us out.
Great. Erica, Eddie, anything to add to mobilize folks?
I'll give Eddie the last word. So yeah, no, I mean, at Raíces, we're also starting, you know, to plan out for voter engagement, and you know, I think there's a lot of work to do there. You know, and this question, I honestly would just kind of take it back to the audience and say, honestly, this is like all hands on deck. Like, even if your organization can only do a very tiny amount of voter engagement, I think that's something. And what's going to be important right now that we're looking at, you know, in conversations with like Voto Latino and you know, there's just so many organizations who've already been doing this work for so long. We're, you know, talking to them, figuring out how we can support. And also just the fact that, you know, COVID is happening. It's greater in some of the states where there's, you know, a big number of Latinos. So we're trying to see how we can also talk about this issue as not just immigration, but also, you know, how it's affecting the community in Arizona and a lot of the states that are going to also be important for November. So yeah, it's all hands on deck. Let's do it. November, it's going to be a game changer.
Eddie?
Yeah, so we don't do, we're a public policy, so we don't do that specific field, but I know almost every partner that I work with are doing some type of, will be doing or are already doing some type of engagement. I think one of the easiest ways to do it is that if you support a candidate, they likely have a voter registration program, and I think you should attach to that. I will make a quick plug because we also, you know, talking about voter suppression, you see that even here in New York, in different parts of New York, but you also see that across the country. One of the things that is not elevated enough is like poll workers. And so if you really want to, you know, personally, you know, combat that, one of the ways you can do is sign up to be a poll worker. There is an aging, you know, demographic of folks that usually do that. And they're not being replaced at a rate, you know, that can sustain any kind of like, you know, sites, right? So one of the big things you can do, you can tell your friend, you know, whether it's your grandmother to your aunt, to your mother, to your brother and sisters to do is sign up to become a poll worker for that day, get trained, because that's one of the biggest ways you can actually combat voter suppression on the site. Because a lot of the times folks pollsters don't have the right information or inadequate or, you know, whatever it is, personal agenda, depending on the demographics. And so people sometimes get turned away because the pollster or the person has different agenda or don't have the right information, but you can change that. So literally Google it and sign up in the county and stay. And that's one of the ways folks should get involved come November.
Our hour's almost up, but I'd like to give each of you a chance to like maybe give a word of encouragement or anything, you know, or okay, maybe a sentence each to our colleagues out there in the nonprofit sector, the advocacy sector.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Erica.
I would just say I'm making a big assumption, but I'll just say that, you know, you're not alone in this. I think we're all going through a really hard time. It's a lot. We are getting so many attacks every day. And so, you know, just if that helps in any way, you're not alone and feeling like you want to do everything, but sometimes you feel like you're not doing enough. So if that helps, and also just really grateful for the work that everybody's doing, I think you know, we're surviving, and we're also thriving in many ways, even under the circumstances.
Okay, and he smiled at me, so that means he wants me to go next. So, you know, this weekend, you know, we lost John Lewis, Congressman Lewis, and, you know, he did so much. And I hope that people find his life's work an inspiration. And I think one of the things that I want to tell all the young people out there, like, some of us can't go out to protest, you guys. Like, we have health conditions that prevent us from going out. We want you to be bold. We want you to be brave. And as Eddie said, we want you to ask us questions. We want you to come in and work with us, challenge us. You know, we need to have robust discussions within our own community. We need to be able to refine what is good and, you know, throw out what is bad. And more than anything else, I hope for everybody who's on this webinar who will listen is to be brave and to be very, very bold, because right now it requires all of us to be bigger than who we thought we could be.
Eddie?
Yeah, I think it's more of a statement of appreciation. I've never seen a group of creative, scrappy individual in my life, and I don't think I will ever meet them outside of the nonprofit sector. The work that, you know, that you folks do, we all do, because we're in the nonprofit sector, but, you know, and particularly those localized that have limited resources, is immensely. You definitely don't do it for the money. You're underpaid, overworked, and yet you have the tenacity to move on, move forward, and serve the community. And I just want to say, you know, thank you to Joanne, to Erica, and to the countless of millions of other nonprofit sector workers in the immigrant rights and CJ sector that do this work day in and day out, and, you know, kick ass every day. So appreciation and thank you.
And I am very, very thankful to you, Erica, Joanne, and Eddie, for this wonderful conversation. The time is too brief, and maybe we can do this again at some point. And thanks to our online audience. If you're interested in learning more about the organizations in our program, we have a slide that includes, or it should come up shortly, which includes there you go, the websites for the Asian American Foundation, Forward US Raices, and also our program. And if you have any questions for me, please feel free to send me an email at erwin.delayon@columbia.edu. And last but not least, I'd like to thank my colleagues at Columbia SPS and the Nonprofit Management Program who put this together: Robin Smith, Liz Picard, and Megan Candio, and so many others. And do please follow us on Twitter and Instagram. You see all the whatchamacallit. See, now I'm showing my age. All the different social media following. So thank you, everybody. Have a good night, and please keep up with the good work. Thank you so much.